Hello, and welcome to a mini episode of Quiet Riot with me, Naomi Smith, and I'm going to start the show with a trigger warning that we will be discussing disease, suicide, and death. So skip this one if you would prefer not to hear about those topics. In 2015, the House of Commons debated an assisted dying bill, and it was defeated by 300 votes to 118. Conservative MPs overwhelmingly rejected it, while Labour MPs were more evenly split. Keir Starmer voted in favour, Angela Rayner and David Lammy voted against. Since then, campaigners on both sides have ramped up their activity, and a host of celebrity figures have broken cover. You may well have seen TV personality Esther Rantzen, who has terminal lung cancer, has joined Switzerland's assisted dying organisation Dignitas, and has been assured by Starmer prior to the election that he would allow a debate and free vote on the issue. True to his word, Spen Valley MP Kim Leadbeater came first in the private members' ballot, and that means she's going to be given some limited time for backbench bills and is bringing forward a fresh proposal to give terminally ill people in England and Wales the right to choose to end their life. Somewhat confusingly, a similar bill was also introduced in the House of Lords by Charlie Faulkner, but 5 minutes before we began recording this show, he has withdrawn it. To help me navigate this moral maze, I'm joined by a leading campaigner for assisted dying. It's Andrew Copson, CEO of Humanists UK. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you.
Andrew, let's start with the big stuff before the detail of the bill, what we hope might be in it, and what levels of parliamentary support there are. You campaign for assisted dying, but what are the main arguments against?
The arguments that people mainly make against it are that instead of having legal assisted dying, we should instead be putting the same money and time into the improvement of palliative care, so specialist care for people who are dying. That's one set of arguments. The second set of arguments that is made against it are that somehow if we make death an option in the medical system, in the legal system, it will begin a slippery slope of making death an option in more and more scenarios until it changes something about our society and we end up valuing death instead of life. And the third type of argument that people make against it is that, well, this is the religious argument really, is that it's not right for people to make these decisions, that suffering has been decreed or that God has preferences and we oughtn't to mess about with the natural course of events. They're the three types of argument that are made. I mean, obviously I disagree with all of them.
Well, presumably on the first one, it doesn't need to be binary. We can invest more in palliative care as well as offering assisted dying.
That's exactly right. And in fact, the Commons Select Committee report on assisted dying that the last Parliament produced made it very clear that in most jurisdictions where assisted dying has been introduced, palliative care has also increased, both in quality and quantity. So far from being a binary choice, there's actually lots of evidence that one boosts the other. And the other problem with the let's invest in palliative care argument is that organisations like the Office of Health Economics found that even if they received the very best palliative medicine, at least 5,000 people a year in the UK would still die without effective pain relief, because palliative care is not, it's not magic. It's still just medicine, which has its limitations. And of course, people at the end of life aren't just concerned about pain. There are other types of distress. There's the sheer boredom and mental distress of waiting to die, essentially, that people can experience, even if they are, technically, physically pain-free. So that first type of argument, you're right, is quite easy, I think, to dismiss.
And where is public opinion on this at the moment? I mean, I don't know if there have been any recent polls about it, but I wondered if MPs will have sensed a mood shift from their constituents since the last time it was debated in 2015.
Public opinion has been pretty consistently in favour, actually, for at least 2 decades. MPs have been quite behind the curve in this respect. Now we're getting more and more polls, of course, thick and fast, since a bill has become a plausible development again. And the latest was a big MRP, which showed 75% support in the country as a whole, and almost 20 constituencies with support at 80%, net support at 80% or higher. I mean, one of my colleagues who looked at this poll said, this there's more support here than even is for free school meals, which is the only other issue that almost uniquely,
Yeah.
almost completely unites different shades of opinion. And polling organisations like More in Common have pointed out that this is one of the rare issues that unites every tribe, as it were, every demographic tribe in the UK.
So it's not simply that older people are against and younger people are in favour.
Older people are much more likely to be in favour, actually. So
Interesting.
older people and people outside of cities are much more likely to be in favour of assisted dying. Why that should be, I'm not quite sure. Well, I suppose older people are more likely to have more direct experience, perhaps with parents of their own who've had difficult deaths or protracted deaths, or they're more likely perhaps to be worrying about it for themselves. But there's a majority everywhere, but older people are actually more likely to be in favour.
Now, you run Humanists UK. You touched on this with, I think, the third of the most common objections to assisted dying. How do you respond to accusations that assisted dying is against God's will, religious doctrine? Is it the case that the religious are broadly against and those without faith are broadly pro?
Well, I mean, to start with the polling question, the public opinion question, it is definitely right that the non-religious people of Britain are much more likely to be in favour of assisted dying than the religious people of Britain. And if you look at just the non-religious people in Britain's opinion, you can start hitting 87, over 90% of people in favour. So it's really, really high numbers in favour of assisted dying being available amongst the non-religious. But in fact, there is no religious group in the UK that is majority against assisted dying. So every religious group in the UK, even Roman Catholics, which have been some of the most vociferous institutional opponents of assisted dying, even a majority of Roman Catholics in the UK, well, in Great Britain at least, are in favour.
I mentioned Esther Ranson at the top of the show, but we've also had people like Tanni Gray Thompson come out for
Mm,
the other side saying that they do not support assisted dying. And
mm.
she's not exactly somebody that one could describe as irrational or regressive. What are her objections, and what would you sort of say is the counter to them?
Well, I can't speak for her, but the objections that I've mainly seen her make are of the second type that I referred to at the beginning of our conversation. That she's one of those who believes that if we go down this road, we are saying something about the lives of people who don't believe their own life to have the quality they would like it to be. People who are incurably suffering, people who have conditions, terminal or not, that in their view makes their life unlivable. Many advocates, she's one of them, believe that if as a society we sanction death as an option, assistance to die as an option in those circumstances, will be somehow devaluing the lives of people who are in the condition of having incurable conditions, incurable suffering. And sometimes that people shade that definition of incurable suffering into what we would otherwise see as disability. And of course, it's naturally right in a society that tries to have justice between disabled and non-disabled people and equality, that we should, of course, want to assist people with any disability in any condition and who are suffering in any way to try and live the best possible lives that they want. I agree with that. I don't think that the option of assisted dying to people who are terminally ill or incurably suffering is in any way at odds with that. In fact, I think it's very complementary with that desire. But there are people who think that if we go down this road, then we will begin to devalue human life, specifically the lives of those who are suffering. I think that the way of avoiding that is to enter into this development very much in the spirit of respecting everyone's individual choice. I mean, it's a bit like the response to the religious argument against assisted dying. The religious argument against assisted dying is, I don't believe that the God that I believe in wants this to happen. You know, well, in a liberal society where we respect each other's different attitudes and different choices and see that human dignity resides a lot in the respect for individual choice that we try to encourage, then of course it's absolutely open to the person whose religion doesn't want them to have assisted dying, not to have an assisted death, and to persuade other people not to have them either. But it's surely not open to them to prevent other people from pursuing their own equivalent choice to have an assisted death. And I think that if we should take the objections of people like Tanni Gray Thompson very, very seriously, but we should attempt to safeguard against the risks that they highlight by emphasising individual choice in that way, in my opinion.
I wanted to ask you about that because if this bill does succeed, it will presumably be a rightly very heavily regulated piece of legislation.
Yes.
So how do we reassure skeptics, and like, what measures would you expect to be included to protect vulnerable people like the elderly, those with disabilities, from this perception that there might be some kind of coercion to end their
Mm.
life before they want to?
Well, I think any assisted dying regime in the world, and there are now 31 places in the world where assisted dying has been made legal in some form or another, any of those systems focuses on three areas. Eligibility, who is actually going to be eligible for this? And in that area, I would certainly like to know that it is adults only who are going to be eligible, that is people who are mentally competent who are going to be eligible, that it's people who are either terminally ill, they've got an advanced progressive condition from which they can't recover, or incurably suffering in the same way, intolerably, intractably suffering. And so eligibility, I think a lot of the protections lie in the eligibility criteria. The second thing that every regime of assisted dying has in common is that it has to have some sort of formal process. And again, then there are aspects of this process that you need to see if you're going to have confidence in a system. So there's got to be more than one doctor involved. There's got to be a doctor who doesn't have a pre-existing relationship professionally or personally with the person who's seeking the assisted death. There's got to be some time in between the person requesting an assisted death for the first time, and then a little time later still saying that it is still their desire, to make sure that this is their own determination. And then the third aspect that's part of any assisted dying system are the safeguards. If we've got eligibility and we've got process, then what are the safeguards, both in the eligibility and the process and in of themselves, that will protect against any harms that we might fear? And there, you're absolutely right. There has to be a very strict assessment of whether or not there's any element of coercion. So those who are involved in the process of granting an assisted death have to be able to satisfy themselves that there has been no coercion. And I think probably in any bill that comes forward, we would also expect to see new duties for healthcare professionals to be alert to these risks, and probably some sort of new criminal offence of, inducing an assisted death or coercing an assisted death, just to make it very, very clear that any assisted dying system has to make sure that it is the person's own uncoerced, determined, settled wish.
We've talked about various different groups, but we haven't yet touched on the group that you've actually just referred to quite a lot during the answer to that last question, and that is the medical community. Where do they sort of broadly stand on this? Are there significant groups within them that are sceptical about this, given that their entire medical training will have been, and experience will have been done with every view to protecting life and
To
extending it
preserve
to
life,
the
yes,
natural
yeah.
end? Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Well, natural end is an interesting concept there, of course, because a lot of medicine, most medicine is unnatural. It's about extending life beyond the point at which we would normally have died. And in most cases, that's a good thing. So I think the idea of a natural end is one that needs to be put aside. Medical professionals on the whole, especially in recent decades, especially through their royal colleges and professional associations, have declared neutrality on this question. That's true of all of the medical bodies, all of the leading medical bodies in England and Wales. Medics' concerns tend to focus around what the system will be like in practice. So, for example, medics will often be very worried about putting any time limit on terminal illness. Some suggested bills in the past have said, oh, well, we ought to limit to 6 months. You can only have assisted dying if you've got 6 months left to live. That's when a lot of medics start to get quite worried, because they say, well, how are we going to make that assessment? Prognosis isn't an exact science. Are we going to be in the firing line if we've got an incorrect prognosis? Are we going to end up smudging prognoses? That tends to be the practical areas where medical, clinical concerns tend to focus. And apart from that, their data would tell us that they're as of the same mind on this general question as the public itself. There are some who are against for their own reasons. There are some who are in favour. The other body of medical opinion, I suppose, to talk about is sort of medical charities who represent people with particular conditions, like motor neuron disease association, or associations that support people with particular conditions, and they too have, especially in recent years, adopted a position of neutrality, essentially.
We don't really know the detail of Kim Leadbeater's bill, but we did know the detail of Charlie Faulkner's
Mm.
now withdrawn bill. What did you make of his bill, and what is your hope for what will be contained within Kim's bill?
Lord Faulkner's bill, I think, probably had three aspects that I thought were unsatisfactory. Firstly, of course, it focused only on the terminally ill. And I do think that, well, you mentioned at the beginning, my role with Humanists UK, and Humanists UK has now campaigned for almost 100 years for assisted dying. And we've always said that it makes no sense to limit assisted dying eligibility to the terminally ill, because there are lots of conditions. We've mentioned some already in this discussion: motor neuron disease. There's also MS, Huntington's, locked-in syndrome of various kinds. There are lots of conditions like that which no doctor would say were terminal necessarily, well, mostly not, but that nonetheless have commanded great public sympathy when people with these conditions have undertaken campaigns to try and have assisted dying. And still, in the press coverage of the bills that are coming up, people with these conditions have appeared as some of the chief advocates of assisted dying. So the first thing I think that was wrong with, or that I've disagreed with in Lord Faulkner's bill, was this focus on terminally ill. The second thing I think was that even within that focus on the terminally ill was to limit it to 6 months. And that's partly for the reasons I've already said, because medical opinion is quite concerned about that. I also think that it doesn't actually solve the problem. Most British people who travel to Switzerland to make use of assisted dying Dignitas, over 50% of them, are not terminally ill with 6 months or fewer to live. That wouldn't include any of them. And it just seems a bit unlikely to me that a bill that we spend all this time on, and a lot of public opinion is spent on, that then leads, when it comes into law, to half the people who are going to Switzerland still having to go to Switzerland. It doesn't seem to me that that is satisfactory. The third thing I worried about in Lord Faulkner's bill was the idea that the High Court had to be involved for every assisted death. I don't think that that is the best system, especially for assisted dying for the terminally ill. I think that we need different sorts of tribunals and committees to make those sorts of decisions. So they were the things that worried me about Lord Faulkner's bill. Now, of course, when it comes to Kim Leadbeater's bill, she has already said that she's going to limit it to the terminally ill. I think that's regrettable, but I think that as of our discussion right now, she has made her final decision on that. It's been widely reported that she is going to limit it to the terminally ill. I believe that some of her parliamentary colleagues have advocated for it to be broader, but she has said she's going to limit it to the terminally ill. What we don't know yet is any of the further detail. Now, I would hope that she won't limit it to 6 months for all the reasons that I've said. I would also hope to see some system in terms of granting an assisted death that didn't, that weren't legally complex, that didn't involve families or dying people to have to go through the courts to achieve this, but that set up some new system involving medical and care professionals and others, perhaps lay people, to make these adjudications. But we don't, as you say, we don't yet know the detail. I would think that whatever she starts off with, I think, will be subject to quite a lot of debate and amendment. There is a bill going through the Scottish Parliament, of course, to provide for assisted dying in Scotland, which has been going on for a very long time now, with lots of consultation and pre-legislative work involving medical advisory groups, international evidence from around the world. And that Scotland bill has not restricted itself to 6 months. And partly that's because in the course of the development of the bill, it was made very clear from medical opinion that that wouldn't really be workable. So I think that even if 6 months does get into a bill, and I hope that that it doesn't at second reading, but if it does start out that way, I would expect at least some members of Parliament to seek to amend it, and I would certainly hope that they would succeed.
On that, now that this is getting so much traction, there will be a bill coming forward into the Commons. There are going to be lobby groups on both sides gearing up to make their case to MPs before they vote, to help draft amendments, etc. But on the side of those in favour of assisted dying, and as is so often the case in the world of campaigns, and don't I, in the pro-European space, know it, you tend to have the People's Front of Judea and the Judean People's Front, those that support assisted dying but only for the terminally ill, those like Humanists UK that would go for a broader definition. Is there a risk that division between campaigning groups in favour of assisted dying means it could fail before it's even begun?
You're so right about this. It's often the case that organisations fighting for various progressive reforms, because they turn on each other, end up, sinking their own boat, as it were.
Yeah.
And that does happen, of course, time and time again. And it's happened in the past with assisted dying. I would hope that won't happen on this occasion. As I say, I think Humanists UK will have to concede, because Kim Leadbeater has already said this, that this bill is only going to cover the terminally ill, for one. So there you go. I mean, that's already a substantial narrowing. A narrowing, by the way, that the British public does not agree with. When I talked about the MRP poll at 75% at the beginning, that was including the incurably suffering, right? So, public opinion is in favour of the broader approach. However, that's not what we're getting. We're getting a bill just for the terminally ill. So then, as you say, the difference between some campaigners is that some people are campaigning for the 6-month limit. Others, Humanists UK would be amongst them, are campaigning for a definition of terminally ill that is more like either the one in Scotland at the moment or the many other European jurisdictions. I mean, there are no European jurisdictions where assisted dying is limited to people with 6 months left to live. So we would be unique if we went ahead with that in England and Wales. Now, that's the big division, I think, to look at. I would hope that if that is resolved, if it can be resolved in favour of not putting a 6-month time limit in it, then campaigners would gather around that. When I talked a moment ago about the definition in Scotland, which, as I say, is broader, in Scotland, Humanist Society Scotland, which is Humanist UK's sister organisation there, Dignity in Dying in Scotland, and other assisted dying groups in Scotland have all rallied round the definition in the Scotland Bill. Now, at the moment, of course, Dignity in Dying in England and Wales has given its support, in the past at least, to 6 months. But if they're supporting it in Scotland, then I can't see any reason in principle why they wouldn't support it in England and Wales. So if we do end up with that more workable, more effective definition of terminally ill that does not time limit it, then I would hope that campaigners can all get around it. Humanists UK will certainly get around any bill that even begins to end the sort of human suffering that any advance in this area would begin to improve.
You talked about international comparisons and just how many other jurisdictions already have assisted dying legislation in place. What lessons can you as campaigners learn from their experiences and how they managed to get that through?
Oh, well, it's extremely difficult because every country has gone about it in its own way. I mean, one of the things that we haven't done formally in England and Wales, of course, is any sort of citizens' jury or deliberative process organised by the government, as it were. There has been a privately run citizens' jury run by the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, very widely respected body, where, of course, as you might expect, all of the citizens in the jury came out in favour of assisted dying. And no one opposed assisted dying for the incurable suffering either. In France, Macron's great citizens' assembly did a similar job. Elsewhere, things have proceeded in the more normal way of public consultation or political, simple government bills through Parliament. So I think what makes our situation really quite different is that it is a private members' bill, and private members' bills don't have the full benefit of the pre-legislative process that a government bill might have. The government is obviously committed to giving time to the bill, a bill. Government also obviously it just plainly has a responsibility to make sure that any legislation that goes through is workable, and no doubt they'll say something about that as whatever bill makes its way through both houses. But I think one of the big differences is that we will be, it seems, in England and Wales, going through that private members' bills process, which just is a bit different. It is much more open to external, not pressure, because that would imply there's something wrong with it, but external opinion. MPs who are debating moving amendments will be drawing on a lot of external support in doing so, whether it's people who are campaigning against assisted dying, people who are campaigning for it, people who are neutral on the principle but are providing their own professional opinions, like the various medical bodies or lawyers or others. It does make the debate much bigger, much wider. And that's, of course, if we get through second reading at all. I mean, I
Well,
think,
let's get into the parliamentary
yeah,
numbers a little bit. These are free votes. MPs won't be whipped, as I understand it. So, is it your sense that the kind of ethical constitution of the current Commons is quite different to that of 2015?
it certainly is in all sorts of, well, if ethics follows demographics, which it often does, then I think we could expect that it would be very different from the 2015 Parliament. Certainly it's a much younger Parliament. It's almost a millennial Parliament if you look at some of the parties' contingents, much more secular parliament, we saw the highest number of secular affirmations ever in the swearing in of new MPs. It's a much more racially and religiously mixed parliament as well, of course, and I don't know what effect that will have on this. As you pointed out in your introduction, it's obviously also a much more left-wing parliament, and although this is not an issue that directly tracks left-right or particular party politics, it certainly would be true to say that in the past, as you said, MPs either from the centre left or left have normally been more likely to vote in favour, not universally, but been more likely to vote in favour. So all the pieces are in place, so to speak, for there to be a quite different result from 2015. But we just don't know. I mean, one of the things about this happening so soon in the new parliament is that a lot of the members of parliament's views are still basically unknown. And although they might be younger, more secular, more left wing, opinions on assisted dying don't necessarily follow in those tracks. There's some polling that's going to come out later this year of MPs, but before the bill gets read, so that won't be particularly helpful to us here. I know that some newspapers have been sniffing around trying to get a sense of MPs' opinion simply by asking them all exactly how they would vote if the vote came this way. I know the Guardian was doing that. And so we may know very soon, but at the moment I would say we don't know. And the thing about assisted dying when it comes to it as well, it is absolutely right that it's completely true. Everything I've said is true about public opinion. It's overwhelmingly in favour in a way that you don't get on almost any other ethical issue. It's hard to get 20 constituents in the country where it's 80% net favourable, and very hard to get 75% of people in favour of anything. It's such a high number. But in the past, that has not swayed members of parliament. In the past, members of parliament have been swayed equally, if not more so, by the minority of people against assisted dying who have filled up their post bags and their inboxes because they're very organised and have done so. And there's also something, I think, about parliamentarians' feeling of responsibility on this issue that might make them more reluctant to vote in favour than perhaps the demographics might suggest. So that's just my very long-winded way of saying I think it might be quite tight in practice. It might be an overwhelming majority, or it might be quite tight. I just don't know.
Well, for listeners who do want to support the campaign and maybe help fill up inboxes in the other direction, where should they find out more?
Everything that you need to contact your own parliamentarians is on our website, humanists.uk.
Great. Thank you very much, Andrew. It's been a pleasure. I think you have handled this conversation very, very delicately, particularly given the fact that you are supportive. I think you've done a lovely job of giving us the arguments from the other side in a dispassionate and calm way. So thank you so much for helping me navigate this important topic.
Well, thank you. I hope that that's the way that the whole country will treat this, because whatever your view, I think it's a very serious debate to have.
Absolutely. And listeners, if you'd like us to interview someone campaigning against assisted dying, then please ask Alex. Don't forget to hit subscribe, follow us on social media. And if you can support us and would like to do so, head over to ko-fi.com/Quiet Riot Pod. That's ko-fi.com/Quiet Riot Pod. Thank you very much for joining us today, and we'll be back again very soon with another show. Bye for now. Quiet Riot is an audio production by Cooler Heads with Naomi Smith, Alexandreo and Kenny Campbell. Music by Mariana Sangita. Artwork by Simona Canellu. Quiet Riot is a co-production with Soundstone Global.